Bueno, hoy contamos con la presidenta de la CCI, Claudia Salomon, muy conocida por todos, por su amplia trayectoria profesional. Yo voy a señalar algunos de los puntos de su carrera. Es ahora árbitro independiente, se ha especializado en disputas, ¿no se oye? En disputas comerciales complejas y también en arbitraje de inversión, arbitraje comercial, áreas especiales o áreas de especialización muy numerosas: construcción, energía, petróleo, gas, energías renovables, servicios financieros, ciencias de la vida, tecnología, telecomunicaciones, etc. Claudia Salomon es fellow del Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Ha publicado también Choice of Venue, International Arbitration, Oxford University Press. Es miembro del New York Bar, solicitor de Inglaterra y Wales. Se graduó en Harvard Law School, cum laude, y en Brandeis University, summa cum laude with honors. Y estudió también en Somerville College, Oxford University. Bueno, desde el 2021, como es conocido, la presidenta de la CCI. Para nosotros, pues es una gran satisfacción poder contar con Claudia Salomon, poder tener esta conferencia Hugo Grocio y escuchar su conferencia, que lleva un título que habéis visto bíblico en su origen, ¿no? Swords into Plowshares, y luego una parte más, vamos a llamar de comentario, que se llama Political Kitsch or Purpose. Claudia, thank you very much for being with us today here. Great honor. As you see, this is a representation of the arbitration community here in Madrid. We are competing with a number of other events which are taking place at just the same time. So thank you again, and you have the floor.
And thank you to Marta for doing everything to make this happen, and to Jordi for being here and representing ICC Spain. I'm particularly happy to join you during the centenary year of the ICC International Court of Arbitration, when we are celebrating 100 years of the ICC Court. And it's really wonderful to have Alfonso, one of the ICC Court members from Spain, here. You are very well represented. Today, I want to talk about the role of international arbitration in promoting peace and prosperity. And to do this, I can't just go back 100 years to the establishment of the ICC Court. I have to go back more than 400 years to talk about Grotius, the namesake of this lecture. So I want to tell you what I think are the two most interesting things about Grotius. The first is that he pulled off one of the greatest prison escapes in history by being smuggled out of a castle inside of a book chest. And yes, that is the man for whom this lecture is named. We know Grotius as the father of international law, but we should also know him as an escape artist. He got on the wrong side of the Calvinists and was locked up in Lowenstein Castle. But he was allowed to continue studying and writing, and the books he needed were regularly sent to him in a very large wooden box. He trained himself to lie still and silently, and with the help of his maid, he escaped from the castle hidden in his chest of books during an annual fair, when obviously no one was bothering to check what was in the box. This is the picture of the castle where he was locked up. And this is presumably the chest, although two different museums in the Netherlands claim to have the original book chest in their collection. So after Grotius escaped, he fled to Paris, and he wrote his famous treatise on the law of war and peace. And in that treatise, Grotius wrote about the just cause of war and the just conduct of war. In other words, he advanced a theory about when war is justified, and he set out rules governing the conduct of war, whether justified or not. Now, we know that his writing has shaped modern thinking about international relations and resolving international disputes for almost 400 years. And that really brings me to what I think is the second most interesting thing Grotius ever did. It was an idea he had. Grotius said that war must be tolerated as a means of solving conflict. He thought it must be tolerated because in his time, 400 years ago, there was no judge who could resolve disputes between nations. In his words, there was no judge for judicial settlement between nations. And without such a judge, Grotius thought we needed to accept that nations would go to war. And he then went on to explain that war would be justified if it had the same justifications as any lawsuit. For example, according to Grotius, the defense and restitution of a thing are just causes of war because you can file a lawsuit, right? To defend your ownership of something or seek to get something returned. Now, I recognize that tolerating war hardly sounds like a civilized idea, much less an interesting one. But I assure you, in Grotius's time, this was a novel idea, if not quite groundbreaking. He was building on the writings of Thomas Aquinas and others, and he helped us consider when and how conflict may be justified. And of course, once you ask that question, the inevitable next question is, how do we not merely justify war, but potentially prevent it? Now, since Grotius's time, some things have changed and some have remained. On the one hand, humans are still trying to escape negative consequences in surprising ways and inventions. And his prison escape reminds me of Carlos Ghosn, the former CEO of Nissan, who escaped from Japan in a box. And that was just a few years ago, escaping criminal charges, and he's now living in Lebanon. On the other, we now do have the equivalent of a judge who can resolve disputes between nations, and that is arbitration. Arbitration has been used for thousands of years, but it wasn't until the end of the 19th century when states began using arbitration to resolve certain disputes, believing that it represented an essential means to achieve the lofty goal of peace through law in a complex and divided world. And in the modern era of arbitration, we have the Jay Treaty of 1794 between the United States and Great Britain. Tension between those two countries was high after the American Revolutionary War. So to achieve peace, the two countries agreed that certain disputes over wartime debts would be resolved by arbitration. That treaty and process for resolving disputes is viewed as having prevented war. And it's the start of the modern era of arbitration. And just as an aside, a few years after the Jay Treaty, in 1799, George Washington, the first president of the United States, who was the general leading the American Revolution, included an arbitration clause in his will in case there were disputes about, about what would be distributed among his heirs. Then, almost a century later, in 1872, we have the famous Alabama arbitration. The US had asserted again against Britain that they had failed to remain neutral in the American Civil War and had allowed the Confederate Navy to use its ports. And the most significant battleship that was at issue was a ship called the Alabama. So for years, those countries had tried to resolve their disputes through diplomacy, and that failed. So eventually, they agreed the dispute would be resolved by arbitration. In that arbitration, the tribunal ordered Britain to pay the United States $15.5 million in gold in 1872. So you can just imagine what the staggering sum that must be in today's dollars or euros. In these cases, as in other state-to-state arbitrations, the nations agreed to arbitration as a peaceful resolution of their dispute by accepting the decision of the tribunal. So back to Grotius. This evening, I will not discuss how he thought we could achieve peace. Frankly, I'm just not qualified to do so. But I'm going to look at the better tools we now have at our disposal to try to achieve peace. Tools far better than Grotius imagined when he constructed his arguments. So I want to use this important platform of this lecture here to consider how arbitration is an essential tool for promoting peace and prosperity, and not just as a peaceful means of resolving disputes between states. Because as we celebrate the centenary of the ICC Court, we should examine the ICC Court's important role in promoting peace and prosperity by facilitating cross-border trade, by creating a peaceful means of resolving disputes between states, disputes that would otherwise spark or justify war in Grotius's day. And I want to close with a discussion about the ways to shape the future of dispute prevention and resolution. Now, to understand the ICC Court's role in promoting peace and prosperity, we need to go back to the founding of the International Chamber of Commerce in 1919 during the aftermath of World War I, a time when no system of rules governed global trade, investment, finance, and commercial relations. A group of entrepreneurs who called themselves the Merchants of Peace sought to promote peace and prosperity through cross-border trade. In fact, their initial motto was world peace through world trade. 4,000 business leaders from Great Britain, France, Belgium, Italy, and the United States met for a multi-day international trade conference in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Now, it may be hard to believe now, but 100 years ago, Atlantic City was booming. At the time, it was known for its resorts and its boardwalk, and even my grandparents had their honeymoon there. Now, this Atlantic City conference was described by one of the attendees as the most important trade conference in history. And it was the corollary, in essence, to the peace conference in Versailles. Now, at that meeting, which should be seen as part of a broader movement to facilitate peace through trade, the conference delegates launched the process that led to the ICC's constitution and foundation, with the first meeting, as shown in this slide, of the ICC taking place at the Sorbonne. And the resolution of disputes wasn't the primary purpose of ICC, but the founders understood that if they were going to promote cross-border trade, they needed a system to resolve cross-border disputes. And from the outset, setting up a center for international commercial arbitration was a priority. In May 1922, the executive board of ICC approved a plan to create an international court for hearing commercial disputes between nationals of various countries. And on the 19th of January of 1923, the ICC court was inaugurated. Now, for the first meeting of the ICC court, 500 government officials and business leaders met at the Tribune de Commerce de la Seine, known today as the Paris Commercial Court in the heart of Paris. So you may be wondering, well, why Paris? It's a beautiful city, and where Grotius went when he was 15 as part of a diplomatic mission, and where he wrote his treatise on war and peace. But 100 years ago, it wasn't so obvious that Paris would be the headquarters. In a wonderful book by Mikhail Shinazi, he writes that the initial documents describing the selection of the city for the headquarters was, quote, to be determined. Atlantic City was even considered as a potential headquarters for the ICC. I think life would be very different if that were the case. The delegates were having so much fun, taking walks on the beach. But ultimately, Paris was selected, perhaps as a compromise between the Americans, who wanted the organization to be close to Geneva, the French, who suggested Washington, and the English, who had suggested Brussels or Paris. And Shinazi writes that the selection of Paris as the ICC headquarters could also have been a gesture to Etienne Clementel, who was a national figure in France and served as the first president of ICC and the first president of the ICC court. And Clementel held various government portfolios, playing a key role in shaping French economic policy. And he was an art patron and an artist himself. And just to provide you with a bit of human interest, the next time you're in the lobby of the ICC headquarters, take a close look and find the bust of Clementel, because it was sculpted by his very good friend, Auguste Rodin. So when we read the documents from that first meeting of the ICC court in Paris, what's remarkable is Clementel's inaugural address included many of the same arguments we hear for why international arbitration should be used over litigation. He said the domestic courts were ill-equipped to handle international disputes when considering the impartiality demanded of judges. He argued that in domestic courts, international disputes are expensive and time-consuming, and he even flagged that international disputes usually bear on questions of technical nature, where judges may not be in a position to handle those cases. So when we launched the centenary of the ICC court celebration on the 19th of January this year, the exact date 100 years ago, when the ICC court was founded, we made a video. And I'm not going to show it to you here, but I really encourage all of you to watch it on YouTube. And Alexander Fesas, the Secretary General of ICC, and Jiva Filipic, the acting Deputy Secretary General, recorded their remarks from the same chamber at the Tribunal de Commerce de la Seine, where the first meeting of the ICC court took place 100 years ago. Now, I recorded my remarks from the United Nations General Assembly building in New York. So why was I there, besides the fact that I'm from New York? So I spoke from the UN because of the pioneering role of the ICC in the adoption of the 1958 Convention on the Recognition and Enforcement of Arbitral Awards, known as the New York Convention. And most significantly, ICC prepared the first draft of what became known as the New York Convention. And once adopted, ICC used its global network to encourage countries around the world to ratify the convention. And now, with more than 170 signatories from around the world, the New York Convention has almost universal acceptance and is the cornerstone of international arbitration. Now, after recording my speech at the UN General Assembly I walked into a small park across the street from the UN. You might have been there. It's on First Avenue and 43rd Street. And in this very small park is a very large granite wall with a famous quotation from Isaiah 2:4. It's carved into the wall, and I'll read in English, that they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And just to make things easier, here is the Spanish translation. And if someone wants to read that out loud in Spanish, my accent will not be good.
Él será juez entre las naciones y árbitro de pueblos numerosos. Con sus espadas forjarán arados y podaderas con sus lanzas. No levantará la espada una nación contra otra, ni se adiestrarán más para la guerra.
Now, the small park with this very large granite wall across from the United Nations is called Ralph Bunche Park, named for the first African-American to win the Nobel Peace Prize, a name we actually should all know. But this quote from Isaiah 2:4 was apparently Ralph Bunche's favorite quote, and I can understand why. It's really a beautiful metaphor for peace. But it's also overused. Staring at this wall, I reflected that for decades, politicians and performers around the world have adopted and co-opted this phrase so frequently it can be viewed as meaningless. I understand it has been used in Spain. It has been used by the Soviets at the height of the Cold War with this statue that was called Mr. Muscles that they donated to the United Nations. Martin Luther King used the phrase when advocating nonviolence. Hopefully you have him. Jimmy Carter, Sadat, Menachem Begin all referenced the phrase in their speeches at the signing of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. I think there we have Martin Luther King. But politicians don't have the market cornered on this phrase. It's shown up in Michael Jackson's song, Heal the World. It's in the lyrics of a Dolly Parton song, Why Can't We? And this phrase has even found its way into the finale of the musical Les Miserables. And I will not sing the epilogue. This was first performed in Paris in 1980, but I'm sure you know the music. They will walk behind the plowshare. They will put away the sword. The chain will be broken and all men will have their reward. And I'm sure you can hear that song. So staring at that wall, walking up and touching the granite, I know this phrase, turning swords into plowshares, is overused, but it beautifully captures what we do at the ICC court. It beautifully captures our purpose. So reflecting on the ICC court and its proud 100-year history, if I say to you that we must work to turn swords into plowshares, is that political kitsch? Or is it our purpose? I believe it is our purpose to promote peace and prosperity through cross-border trade. And that purpose is even more important today. Social scientists have long tried to understand whether, in fact, trade integration contributes to peace. And I can't dive into that topic in depth this evening. I'm just going to refer you to a 2009 study by the Asian Development Bank that was rerun by the same authors in 2016. And that study found an increase in bilateral trade interdependence and global trade openness significantly reduces the probability of military conflict between countries. And trade reduces the possibility of conflict. The effect of trade on promoting or keeping peace varies depending on the geographic proximity between countries. So we now hear that the war in Ukraine stands out as evidence that trade interdependence does not make war impossible. And that is true. But the arc of recent history demonstrates that war is less likely as military conflict between trading partners becomes more costly and illogical. So we have to think of the role of the ICC Court in promoting peace and prosperity in two respects. The first and primary element is providing a trusted dispute resolution process that facilitates cross-border trade among private parties or with states or state-owned enterprises acting in a commercial capacity. Most of the parties in ICC cases are private businesses or individuals, but now 25% of the parties are states or state-owned enterprises. And the second is that the ICC Court provides a peaceful mechanism for resolving disputes between states themselves. The very mechanism that Grotius says was not available in his day, and for him, why war had to be tolerated. Now, while purely state-to-state cases at the ICC Court are rare, we see a significant number of cases involving states versus SOEs, state-owned enterprises, or SOEs versus SOEs. In other words, we are seeing states engage in cross-border trade with each other through their state-owned enterprises and opting to resolve their disputes through ICC arbitration. Since 2020, we have had at least 120 cases between states or states via their state-owned enterprises. And as reported in the Global Arbitration Review, so not disclosing any confidentiality, these are publicly reported cases. A few months ago, an award was issued in an arbitration between Iraq and Turkey in a multi-billion-dollar oil dispute from a pipeline transit agreement. The state-owned Czech energy company announced it was launching an ICC arbitration against Gazprom over undelivered Russian gas, following an announcement by Ukraine's state-owned oil and gas company that it had launched an ICC arbitration claim against Gazprom. A subsidiary of a Chinese-owned mining company said it intended to launch an ICC arbitration after armed forces allegedly occupied a site of its copper mining project in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You can just imagine Chinese armed forces, copper mining, Democratic Republic of Congo elements that would otherwise lead to war, but instead are leading to ICC arbitration. And these are just a few examples. Now, while some of the cases arise out of war, I submit that arbitration itself is a means of promoting peace, or at least avoiding war between states. Now, in Grotius's time, how would these disputes otherwise have been resolved, if not by war? So while discussions about mechanisms for resolving disputes between states may focus on the United Nations or the International Court of Justice, the ICC Court has played an important role in promoting peace and prosperity over the last 100 years. But arbitration must also evolve to meet new challenges. So now that ChatGPT can pass the bar exam, and you might be wondering if ChatGPT wrote this lecture. Well, I can assure you that it did not. We must think carefully about how we want to resolve disputes in the years ahead and ask whether the systems we currently rely on will meet the needs of the future. So in short, is the process of arbitration that we know today fit for the disputes of tomorrow? In this new business environment, how can we continue to achieve our purpose, to turn swords into plowshares, to promote peace and prosperity? the practice of arbitration is not set in stone. Various new innovations have provided an answer to growing concerns about time and cost. For example, under the expedited procedures, an arbitration award in ICC arbitration can be obtained within 6 months. And we now have over 500 of these cases and know the process works. Likewise, parties can obtain emergency relief from an emergency arbitrator when they previously only had the option of going to court. More recently, our new digital case management platform, Case Connect, enables streamlined communications and file sharing among parties, the tribunal, and the case management teams. And over the last 2 years, we have changed the way we live and work and how international arbitration is conducted. And virtual hearings are the clearest example of how we have all adapted to using different tools. This is just the start of how ICC has updated its dispute prevention and dispute resolution services to meet the ever-changing needs of business. So in this centenary year, we've looked to the past, and so we also have to look to the future. In conjunction with the launch of our centenary, the ICC issued a declaration on guiding principles for the future of dispute prevention and resolution. We sought to mirror the pioneering vision of the Merchants of Peace, the founders of the ICC Court. So what are the priorities of the ICC Court for the next century of dispute prevention and resolution? Let me just take you through a few. We must start by pledging to ensure access to justice and the rule of law by providing accessible, affordable, predictable, and effective dispute prevention and dispute resolution services to everyone, every day, everywhere. So when we think about dispute prevention and resolution in the future, will parties be on an express train from the start of the arbitration to the final award? Or will parties look to more facilitated settlement, not only before an arbitration is filed, but even once it's begun? Will dispute boards or standing mediators become more common to assist in avoiding or resolving disputes in long-term contracts? Can expert determination be used more frequently to enable a timely and cost-efficient final decision on a specific issue? How can we enhance the possibility of a negotiated settlement after arbitration has been commenced? Well, the report on the ICC Task Force on ADR and arbitration will be released soon, so watch this space. In Pledge 5 of our declaration, we pledge to improve transparency in the dispute prevention and resolution process, enabling the democratization of information, consistency, and a greater understanding and trust in the process, while respecting the legitimate expectations of confidentiality. Under my predecessor, Alexi Moore, major steps were taken to increase the transparency of the process, including providing reasons for decisions on challenges, publishing the names and nationalities of arbitrators, and publishing arbitral awards when the parties so agree. Last year, we broadened the scope of our partnership with Jus Mundi to enable wider access to our dispute resolution library, and there is a free download of the latest issue of the ICC Dispute Resolution Bulletin. But these are important steps, without a doubt. But in the future, we must go further, and I call this Transparency 2.0. And in Transparency 2.0, we have a vision that anyone can read our rules, anyone can read our materials, and anyone can understand our process. We have a project underway examining our model letters, our rules, our notes to the parties and arbitrators, so stay tuned in this regard. In Pledge 7, We pledge to amplify the benefit of the digitalized economy and leverage technology to deliver efficient and pioneering solutions. That's taking our current Case Connect to the next level. And these are just some of the fundamentals of the future that I see as important. My crystal ball is limited, so let me just ask you, will dispute resolution procedures for low-value disputes be the same as the arbitration process we used for high-value disputes with just shorter timeframes? Or will AI and blockchain technologies give us a way to help small and medium-sized enterprises resolve their disputes in a completely different way? What is going to be the acceptable trade-off between robust due process and a faster and less expensive decision? Will parties be willing to give up the opportunity to make one more written submission or obtain additional documents to get that matter resolved by a predictable date? When justice delayed is justice denied, will global business, and especially small and medium-sized enterprises, accept a less than perfect process rather than no process at all through AI, blockchain, or other mechanisms? Okay. So my answer to all those questions is the same. I don't know. I have educated guesses, but I don't yet have the answers. There is one aspect, though, of the future in which I have a high level of certainty, and that is our dedication to diversity and inclusion set out in Pledge 8. The ICC was born in Paris, gained momentum originally in Europe, but we are now global, and the global business community rightfully expects, they rightfully demand that their decision makers reflect that same diversity. We've made great strides in gender diversity in international arbitration, but our work is not yet done. And we are focused on diversity broadly defined. So in the coming months, look for a guide on disability inclusion in international arbitration, just approved by the ICC Commission on Arbitration and ADR. Look for the expansion of the LGBT+ network. And with increased calls to track race and ethnic diversity, I ask you, can we come up with a global system that is workable and legal? We are working on that, but I also welcome your ideas. So to close, I say this. If we just celebrate the launch of the declaration and then put it in a drawer, all of this talk about turning swords into plowshares is indeed political kitsch. But if we take these pledges as guideposts in which we continually assess whether we are on track, we can achieve our purpose. Arbitration and ADR can indeed help promote peace and prosperity through cross-border trade. We can turn swords into plowshares. 400 years ago, Grotius thought war must be tolerated only because he lacked the tools to prevent it. We have tools today that he needed but didn't know about. But like Grotius, we can't see what the future holds. What other tools will the future deliver? What other tools will the future deliver to promote peace and prosperity? And what threats and traps await us just around the corner? All we can do is our best. If we do that, maybe we can fulfill the bold dream that we memorialized at the very end of our declaration, that it is our hope that future generations will reflect on our contemporary achievements with the same reverence that we have for our predecessors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for this very interesting and enjoyable talk. You have brought us back to the origins in the centenary of the ICC. And as you showed us, the purpose of Grotius was very much the purpose of the ICC. Peace and prosperity, peace through trade, world peace through world trade. And this was also at the origin of these modest Hugo Grocio's lectures that we have been conducting for 14 years now at the CIAMEN and at the Royal Institute for European Studies. We are very lucky that finally it was Paris and not Atlantic City. I mean, we have, traveled to Atlantic City, but it was a bit more complicated. And also the reflections that you gave us on IA and the future of international arbitration were very much to the point. ChatGPT managed to get a 90% of the answers to entrance into the bar exam right, as you mentioned. So it's not bad at all. Let's see. Indeed, the future is uncertain, but it will continue the activities of the ICC to follow on these steps which were at the origin. Peace, prosperity, trade, and we as part of this purpose and of this enterprise are very lucky to have you here today to remember us about these basic fundamentals of what we are doing, our trade as lawyers, as arbitrators. In the centenary to have you here, that was really a great treat. Thank you very much, Claudia.